What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm going to be talking about my first ever 180 card cube design that I refer to as the original Recipe Twobert. I realized as I started this podcast, I didn't really offer much of my history or talk about things that I have designed in the past you might be familiar with. I just kind of assumed if you're listening to this, you probably knew who I was before. But even if that's the case, I think it's good to both kind of compile everything, provide links to things I've worked on in the past so I can build on my body of work that way. And I've also just written and made a lot of things over a long period of time now, so it's good to have that refresher. So today I'm going to offer some resources for things that I've worked on, how I got into 180 card cubes, things that I believe about the design, some approaches that I've taken to designing these. I'm going to share links that show how I started, while also offering some insights on things that I've learned over the years. My last couple episodes I've talked about more recent designs, and they do deviate from some of the fundamental things in that first 180 card cube design. And today I'm going to go a little bit deeper, talk about how my thoughts on this kind of thing have changed and how I've evolved my methodology. And I'll also be talking a little bit about an update that I made to the original Recipe Twobert this week. Over the last year, that design has gotten away from me a little bit, and I just made an update that I'm pretty excited about that grounds the cube in a little bit more familiar space for that design for me. And I'm excited to revisit that cube, employing some knowledge that I've learned as I've explored a lot of different designs over the last few years. So let's go ahead and dig in. I guess where I want to start is that I use the word Twobert a lot less these days than I did when I was first writing about these. When I started writing about Cube back in 2020, there was kind of this public perception. I think even today, most commonly when people hear the word cube, certainly the most popular and well-known cubes are going to be the digital cubes. The vintage cube on Magic Online remains the most well-known cube. I don't see any reason why that would change. And there's sort of an expected implicit assumption when you say cube, it's pretty common that people think you're talking about an 8-player draft or an environment that could support 8, even maybe if you're playing with fewer or more players. So given that I was writing about much smaller cubes designed for 2 or 4 players, it was kind of important to have that in the headline. I didn't want it to be misleading, and you want to invite people into what you're actually talking about there. It would be a really inefficient use of words to have every title say 180 card X cube for 2 to 4 players, so just having a name for it was useful at the time, and the name did catch on. I do see or hear the word Twobert in the wild sometimes, which is pretty fun for me, but it's no longer an essential need to say, all right, we're talking about a specific kind of cube, we're talking about the 180 card cubes only. Cube's just bigger today than it ever has been. There's a lot of community-run cube events now that are popping up. CubeCon's been going for a few years. I don't actually know the metrics for how many people would read my articles or what the listener base was for the 540, but I've spent a lot of time talking about Twoberts and 180 card cubes, so word has gotten out at least in some capacity. And of course the name of this podcast, 180 MTG, it's pretty forward about the size of cube that I prefer. I did think about doing something silly like calling the podcast Talking Twoberts, but I went with something a little bit cleaner. And I think in 2025, now that I've spent a few years working on these and sharing my designs, it's something that's a little bit more approachable and a little bit more familiar than when I started writing about this kind of stuff. Alright, so in the show notes, I'm going to have 3 links that are kind of fundamental to 180 card cubes, at least to my work on them. The article that I first wrote back in 2020, with a horrible title, The Proper Way to Do 2-Player Cube Drafts. It's largely just about the design of the original Recipe Twobert when I first built it. I'm going to link to the 540 episode where Justin Parnell and I talk. Largely, Parnell just kind of interviews me about the concept. We talk a lot about that original design as well. And then I made a video on YouTube recently. I tried YouTube for a little bit. It was a lot less comfortable for me than podcasting, both recording and editing. So far, I've been able to produce a podcast weekly, so I'm a lot happier with that, a lot less friction on that. But anyway, I'm going to link that YouTube video as well, where that's going to be more recently me retrospectively talking about the design of the original Recipe Twobert And I'm not going to go super in depth and repeat myself and just do that video again on the podcast. I'm going to bring up the points that I make in that video. The video is 20 minutes. It's not super long to watch, but I'm going to just acknowledge the key points in that video and then expand on ways that my thinking has changed and then pull examples that I have talked about already on the podcast here, ways that my design methodology and process has changed relative to cubes I've already talked about on the podcast here. So you'll be hearing some references to Return to Midgar, my Final Fantasy VII themed cube, as well as the pre-modern Twobert today. I'll try to talk about things in a way where none of that older material is required listening or reviewing, but you'll get more depth on those topics if you are interested and you want to go back and visit that stuff. The first thing I want to say is that the 180 card size is clearly still working for me. It is the name of the podcast after all. There are reasons to deviate. In my YouTube video, I tried to take a more wishy-washy approach and say, you can do whatever you want to do. And it is true that I am currently working on my first smaller cube that's a different size at 180 cards. More on that at another time. But I have found that for 180 cards, if you're just doing 2 or 4 player drafts, there's enough variance in the 2-player draft where it's engaging regarding what actually shows up, and you can't always count on the fixing or the spells that you want, and so you do kind of have to focus. You're rewarded for paying attention and for navigating the draft well. And the 180 card cube size is actually what caused me to fall in love with 4-player drafts. Something I expressed on the 540 is that I really did not like 4-player drafts for 360 or 540 card cubes. Everything was just really messy. Decks were always bad. You so rarely saw the pieces that you want for what you were trying to draft. And 4-player drafts with 180 cards, there is a different kind of issue where they do really stress test your design, but I've learned to really like that. I do intend to do another podcast where I more in depth look at 4-player drafts with 180 cards and how that will impact your design, how that will help you refine your design, and how it ends up being really fun once you get your design to a place where it's designed for those 4-player drafts. But that's a topic for another time. Back to the just general design for 180 card cubes, there's a concept that I explored in my YouTube video and that I referenced on the 540 using different names. I just kind of hadn't shaped the language or decided how I wanted to refer to these things. On the 540, I referred to this as the one thing, and on YouTube, I referred to this as a macro archetype. But the general concept is for my 180 card designs, I select one thing that is just the general rule for inclusion. When I talk about a macro archetype, that's going to be, okay, there's a style of deck, every card has to fit into that style of deck. So for the original Recipe Twobert, it's mid-range. All of the cards have to go into like a mid-range style deck. I do think that the macro archetype, it does work for some designs, but recently in Magic, and definitely in a lot of the designs I've been working on more recently, there is a little bit more of an aesthetic focus than a mechanical focus. So while it's a worse term, I think that talking about the one thing on the 540 was maybe a little bit more apt than something as rigid as a macro archetype, where, to pull an example that I've covered on the pod, in Return to Midgar, the one thing, the cube was about Final Fantasy VII. So every card had to be in service of the Final Fantasy VII aesthetic. The original Recipe Twobert, it's really heavily focused on mid-range cards. I'm going to have a link to the Cube Cobra page for that cube in the show notes here as well, so you can check that out. But everything is trying to play to the battlefield, you're trying to grind out advantages, and a lot of the motivation for the design is that you would play cards kind of regardless of if you were aggressive or controlling. The cards are just kind of good in any kind of deck. Where if you look at the pre-modern Twobert, I think you can make an argument that it very much is following a similar structure, where the cube is generally mid-range, but there's more examples of cards that fit into more extreme space. Jackalpup is an example of a card that you really only want to play if you're very aggressive. If you expect your opponent's going to be doing a lot of blocking, or more importantly, that you are going to have to do a lot of blocking, Jackalpup is kind of unplayable. And then there's Sulfuric Vortex, which also is really only going to be good if you were the aggressor in a given matchup. And then something about the pre-modern Twobert. I do have some sweepers in the original Recipe Twobert, but they use gold slots. I have Supreme Verdict and Damn. So they're more going to show up in Azorius or Orzhov decks. There's the possibility to just play Dam in your white deck that doesn't have black. But in the pre-modern Twobert, I actually have Wrath of God and Rout. And there's a lot of white creatures that don't necessarily play great with that. Mother of Runes and Wrath of God, it's not just wrong to have them in the same deck, but it's not going to happen super often, and it's usually something where it's going to be because a specific matchup dictates that you're going to want both of those cards, maybe in different shapes of games. Something about the original Recipe Twobert, though, is that it is designed to be rigid and prescriptive in this way. It's designed to just be a proof of concept for a way that a 180 card cube can work. So it makes a lot of sense that when I work on that cube, I really focus on, okay, is everything falling under this macro archetype? Does everything really fit this environment? Would you play this in a very broad range of decks here? But then when I work on other cubes that are kind of borrowing for this recipe and peppering in their own elements of design to taste, you're going to see deviations there. And I think it's a really good guiding principle to have your cube be kind of about one thing. But then as you introduce elements that fit into that thing, maybe there's some stuff that you have in the cube that is good in some decks, not good in others. It's good to deviate a little, especially if it's something that lends itself to your cube's own identity. Talking about the pre-modern Twobert, Jackal Pup, Sulfuric Vortex, Wrath of God, Mother of Runes. These are all just iconic, timeless cards that are really associated with that era in Magic. So I could choose one or the other, but I think it's better for that environment, for the aesthetic of that environment, that they're all part of the spread. And this all relates really strongly to another fundamental aspect of the original Recipe Twobert, which is every color gets exactly 23 monocolor cards, so technically you could shuffle up 17 basic lands and play 5 monocolor decks if you were so inclined, and that was part of the methodology to making sure that that cube was playable when I had never played in the 180 card space before. Last week, while talking about the pre-modern Twobert, I'd made a reference to the 23-card blue deck, maybe struggling a little bit against some of the other colors, and I realized, kind of in retrospect, I had not talked about that concept on the podcast before, so that was some of my motivation to tackle this topic today. Importantly, that 23-card number, it's not a hard rule that I always abide by. In fact, in Return to Midgar, I have more than 23 cards of any monocolor. And the reason that I deviate from this is largely because I've done a lot of 2 and 4 player drafts with 180 card cubes at this point. And some environments, they support this more. You're more inclined to maybe play most or all of one color. But even then, it rarely happens that players do end up in those monocolor decks in practice. I can say off the top of my head, I've seen the mono white or nearly mono white deck in the Tempo Twobert a couple times. I've seen a handful of monocolored decks in my all one drops 180 card cube that I call the Onebert, that I'm sure I'll be covering at another time on the podcast here. But typically you're playing 2 or 3, sometimes more colors in these environments. It just doesn't shake out that you can just play those monocolored decks, and even if they are designed to be cohesive, it's usually the case that there is some power or some appeal to going into additional colors anyway. And so these days I don't really think about those monocolored decks as much. I'm more thinking about things in kind of a color pie perspective, where I'm asking myself, do these cards within one color play well with cards in that color? And just generally, are there incentives to want to do this kind of thing in this color? So to get into something a little bit more concrete there, I was talking earlier about Mother of Runes and Wrath of God, and while those cards often won't go in the same deck, what does make them appealing and make them both fall into white in the pre-modern Twobert is that either card plays really well with Exalted Angel. You can easily imagine a situation where you're trying to cast Exalted Angel, and having Mother of Runes to back it up can make that really powerful. It can supplement that kind of game plan. You can also easily imagine a situation where you're trying to play a controlling role, and either Exalted Angel could be a Haymaker, a giant 4/5 lifelinking flyer, or Wrath of God could be the tool that's called for if your opponent's battlefield has gotten too far ahead of that kind of thing. So just making sure that there's an avenue to want to play a card within a color is kind of where I want to be, just making sure that the color is coherent and approachable to a drafter. Even if there are multiple lanes, I do want the cards to have some appeal without monocolor slots being used only for multicolored decks with specific color pairs in mind. It is the case that Mother of Runes is going to be most at home in a green-white deck. It's going to be less appealing in maybe blue, black, and red, but it does play in many of those combinations. Maybe Wrath of God explicitly plays pretty badly with green, but blue, black, and red all have reasons to consider playing a Wrath of God deck, so there's enough appeal to it that it's not just outright a 1-2 color gold card kind of thing. It's just a card that is good in a lot of white decks. There's more to explore in that topic of cube color pies, but that's another topic that I'm going to bookmark for another day. Those are the cliff notes that are useful for just understanding kind of the base design and how my specific thinking has evolved going from the original Recipe Twobert to stuff like the pre-modern Twobert and Return to Midgar. The next guiding principle I want to touch on is the concept of a cube mana curve. This was a pretty important aspect of the original Recipe Twobert. And kind of a lot of that design, it starts with every color gets a 6-drop. And then I go down the curve and kind of shape games. A lot to do with how those 23-card monocolor decks are configured. Okay, the black deck is going to be top-ended by Grave Titan. So then some of what I'm asking myself is, what does the infrastructure for a Grave Titan deck look like on the lower parts of the mana curve? There's some stuff on the lower part of the curve that's not necessarily great in the Grave Titan deck. Not everybody has the heart to put Dark Confidant in a deck with 6 drops, but it is an option, and that 23-card deck, it is functional. It's not the case that I'm trying to make the 40-card mono black deck the dream, the goal for the cube. It's just something that is functional and is appealing. I do want to stress that even in the original Recipe Twobert, where I was pretty firm on that being an aspect of the design, the intention was never for the monocolor decks to be the best thing going on. It was always to encourage players to mix and match and find the space that they find the most fun and the space that they think will be the most competitive. So back to the cube mana curve. There's nothing scientific about having one 6-drop in every color. It's just something that has a really good brain feel. Certainly when I'm narrowing in on a card like Grave Titan, I think about that entire Titan cycle. There were more members of that cycle in this cube when I first built it. I used to have Inferno Titan and Frost Titan. But I always found that Primeval Titan and Sun Titan weren't great fits, so I had different 6-drops in those colors. But there is just sort of this mythos about a 6-drop, and it was really introduced by that Titan cycle, where when those cards were printed, they really changed Magic. It suddenly was the case where if you're going to spend 6 mana or something, it should win the game. Maybe that was the case before, but it was less true that the 6-mana spells did actually win the game. Amusingly, I ended up with one 6-drop in every color in the pre-modern Twobert as well. I didn't have that as an explicit goal for that cube. I always had Visara the Dreadful, but the other pit fighters, the other 6-mana creatures, they had been in and out of the cube. And one day I just decided it's way cooler to just have all of them. There is sort of that mythos around 6 mana. It's this big number, but it also just feels achievable. Like a 7-drop is a line where you're like, okay, you can't just play a 7-drop in a normal deck. But one 6-drop is like, okay, I have this thing that I'll play sometimes when the game gets to that state. Maybe I have to have some card selection, some looting or rummaging or whatever, so I don't get this card stuck in my hand, but it will be useful some of the time. But then other environments can have very different needs and very different shapes of their mana curves. For example, my Tempo Twobert has almost nothing that costs more than 3 mana. The whole idea is that everything's going to be pretty cheap there. Return to Midgar is a cube that does have some 6-drops, and some colors, there's just multiple aesthetically resonant cards that cost more mana, so I slotted all of those in, and then I'm kind of building the mana curve around that. And some of the colors just don't have a 6-drop. I'm not going to go out of my way to make sure that every cube has some big 6-mana thing. It's fun to do when it makes sense. It's fun to do when the mana curve of your desired cube can build to that, and it just fits very naturally. But it's nothing that you have to force, is really the point that I want to drive home here. And a lot of my 180 card cubes, they don't facilitate this aspect of mana curves. I have some, like I said, the Tempo Twobert that skew much lower, and then I have environments like the Eldrazi Twobert, which I'm sure I'll cover another day on the podcast, which involves casting a lot of gigantic spells. So the mana curve looks very different from cube to cube. I really like, for cubes that are trying to play ABC, kind of fundamental Magic on the battlefield, having some acknowledgement and some construction around a small sampling of 6 mana value spells is a number that just makes a lot of sense and can be really cool and fun in this regard, but it's not a hard rule for every design in this space. Now I want to talk a little bit about gold cards and colorless cards. For the original Recipe Twobert, I have 3 cards for every 2-color pair when it comes to multicolor spells, and really colorless cards were just the last couple slots. I filled in some colorless cards until I had 180 cards so I could actually draft with 4 players. So I put a higher importance on the gold cards, and realistically, when I'm thinking about gold slots, these are cards that I give more scrutiny to than monocolor cards, because when it comes to gold cards, they're harder to cast. There should be more reason to put them in decks. I think that it's more important, at least the way that I design cubes, where I want every card to be playable. It's more important that gold cards make decks, and they're not going to show up every time. Just by nature of being harder to cast than monocolor cards, it's just going to be the case that based off of the colors that people are in, some gold cards categorically are not going to be castable or will require you to make a splash. So I do put more weight on how I select these slots, and I try to make it so gold cards in 1-color pair generally are appealing in the same deck, even more so than when it comes to monocolor cards. Just because generally, when it comes to 2-color pairs, there's not going to be multiple drafters at the table that are both in those same 2 colors. It's just less likely. So there's usually 0 or 1 players that are in blue and white. So ideally, all 3 blue and white cards will be appealing to the 1 drafter that's in that pair. And a consequence of this heightened scrutiny is that I just find myself eschewing gold slots. If I have an Azorius card, it doesn't mean that I have to have a Rakdos card, because the barrier for entry is just higher. If I have 1 card in 1-color pair that I really like, it doesn't mean I have to force something else to happen. And that's loudly on display in Return to Midgar, where I really only have gold cards that are for essential themes and really prominently featured characters in the game, and some color pairs just don't have cards. This is less loud but also true in the pre-modern Twobert, where I have 2 gold cards for every 2-color pair, except for Boros. There's just no Boros cards because the Boros cards are just so much weaker and so much less appealing, and also less iconic than any of the other 2-color pairs. They're not necessary to make the cube functional, and there's no reason to stress about it and put in cards that are just not fun or appealing, especially when you're drafting with a small number of players and playing such a high percentage with a 2-player draft or all of the cards in the cube for the 4-player draft. It is important to me for them to all be relevant game pieces. Colorless slots I'm a lot more lax with, just because generally, as a rule, a colorless spell can go into any deck. You certainly don't have to care about your mana-fixing lands when it comes to colorless cards, at least when they don't have those Eldrazi wingdings in the casting cost. I generally like using colorless slots for nuts and bolts stuff, just stuff that will make any deck, but importantly won't be the most significant aspect of any deck. For colorless cards, because they can show up in any deck, because they'll generally be played in more drafts than not by virtue of being more castable than other cards, you do have to be a little bit more careful here. Even something with a lower ceiling than some of your monocolor and certainly some of your multicolor cards could prove to be more problematic in practice. And that's really why I don't generally allocate a certain amount of space to make sure that I have some colorless options in any given cube. I'm totally fine if there's no colorless spells in a cube, just because they can be really problematic if they end up being too good, and if you put in a bunch of weak options because you're very worried about that, then that's not very fun or exciting either. So unless I have a specific aspect of my design, something aesthetic, or like the artifact Twobert where I want a lot of artifacts, then I'm just not going to go out of my way to have too many colorless slots. I just want a handful of appealing but not overly powerful slots here. And then the last general note about 180 card cube designs before I get into some nitty-gritty details with the recent updates to the original Recipe Twobert is just going to be about lands. I have found that about 30 lands is really where I want to be for 180 card cubes. And there's different ranges of mana fixing, different power levels you can tune to using this same number of lands just by the cycles that you choose. In the original Recipe Twobert, I have shock lands, creature duels, and fast lands, and that makes for pretty good mana for 2 or 3 color decks. Return to Midgar as an interesting spread, where I have tri-lands and pain lands. Often when you include 3 color lands in a cube, that's going to push players towards playing 4 or 5 colors, just because once you get 2 tri-lands, 3 tri-lands, you start having access, at least in a small number, to most or all of the colors in Magic. But then pain lands make it less appealing to go into a bunch of colors because the more you have to use those for colored mana, the more damaging they are. The tri-lands all enter tapped as well. When you get into space with fetch lands and fetchable duels, then you really start seeing 4 and 5 color decks show up. That's been an aspect of the tempo Twobert, but then the low mana curve pushes back against it some. There's a lot that you can do here, even just sticking to that 30 land number, and it just has felt like a good number, largely because of that range of outcomes that you can have just by selecting different cycles. Even with 30, I usually like to have 1 or 2 like 5 color options or even colorless options in the spread. And then some environments are going to naturally have fewer lands, certainly if you're using with the old card frame. The pre-modern Twobert, for example, it has original duels, pain lands, and allied fetch lands, because the enemy fetch lands didn't exist yet. But the fetch land fetchable duel thing, it's enough power, and because fetch lands plus fetchable duels can really go into any deck, Wooded Foothills is not just a red-green land, it's really a 5-color land where you have to check some boxes to facilitate it. That 25 lands feels a lot like some different selections of 30 lands. And then when I have to go lower, if I'm looking at closer to 20-25, then it's more important for me to add more of those multicolor slots, that cube having City of Brass and Grand Coliseum. And I want to be clear that if you want less mana fixing in your cube, fewer mana fixing lands, certainly if you're trying to design an environment that's closer to retail limited, sure, it makes plenty of sense to go lower. I personally have a bias towards trying to have stronger mana bases. I like being able to cast my spells in cube. I am more of a constructed player than a limited player, so making sure that my cubes have pretty robust mana bases is something that I value pretty highly. I also think this is something that Patrick Sullivan said on the Receivables. I think it was when they did Alpha Beta Unlimited. I believe it's something that he said just kind of about the basic lands resource system of the game, where it's a little bit too hard in a fundamental sense to play a 2-color deck. And when you look at mana bases, even for constructed decks, if you go back to like Odyssey era, granted this is over 20 years ago, but Blue-Green Madness was a really strong format-defining deck, and it was a 2-color deck that played 4 pain lands and a bunch of basic lands. And if you ever tried to play this environment, and you compare it to current or any recent constructed environment, the mana is just so bad. It's weird to think that we tolerated that as players for so long. So I don't find it fun when I'm playing a 2-color deck and it's really hard to cast my spells. And that is kind of an aspect of the game. In fact, Randy Buehler got a lot of pushback when he wanted to put tapped 2-color lands in Invasion. He had to fight hard to make Coastal Tower just a land that taps for blue or white that enters tapped. He got a lot of pushback internally, and there are valid concerns when it comes to mana being too good. The 5 colors being a very important aspect of Magic. You don't want to just let people play 4 or 5 colors very easily, but like we're talking about Coastal Tower, you know? So there's certainly a line. I value stronger mana, and it makes sense to me, and I understand why some players might value weaker mana bases. You really don't want to end up in that spot, and I don't like ending up in that spot where it's really easy to just play all the colors, and you play all the best cards wherever on curve because it's a little bit too easy to cast them. But there's a middle ground between having fetch lands, triomes, shock lands, original duels, and not allowing Coastal Tower in your environment. Alright, so now it's finally time to talk about the big update that I dropped to the original Recipe Twobert this week. You can see the update on the blog on Cube Cobra. I ended up changing about a dozen cards over the course of the last week, and they're not new cards. The only card from Edge of Eternities that I'm currently trying is Nova Hellkite. Personally, I don't think that set really does a lot for the aesthetic that I'm going for here, but there is something going on with kind of modality. I like mechanics that are like Kicker, specifically Nova Hellkite being able to show up for just the cheap effect to hit once and then the dragon later. There's definitely a lot going on in this cube. Adventure being a mechanic in that space, a Bone Crusher Giant being something very similar to Nova Hellkite, where being able to split your mana and choose really how you want to spend your mana is definitely something going on in this cube. But more than that, this update has to do with reverting some stuff that happened as a consequence of 2 things. One of those things was Modern Horizons 3, where I ended up trying a bunch of cards that were pretty strong. I think I did one draft with the Modern Horizons at Johnny before I didn't like it. But then there was some stuff that kind of lingered. The card that was really loud to me is I had Psychic Frog in the cube, and I was really worried about it. Because Psychic Frog is a card that can generate turn over turn value and really take over games, and it also doesn't fit the environment in some other ways, where the 0 mana effect to discard a card and get a +1/+1 counter is really different from that exact notion I was describing about choosing how to spend your mana. Free spells really aren't at home here. I want you to be spending mana to do things. There's already enough going on that I think is very interesting and compelling just regarding how to spend your mana and how to navigate combat, how to manage planeswalkers, etc. in this cube. That free effects, they're not adding to it, they're just adding a different kind of complexity and a different kind of power level that the rest of the cube is just not about at all. But I fell into a trap for a while, where I played games and Psychic Frog, it felt fine in games, it does die to a lot of the removal, but there's still going to be games where the game becomes about discarding all my cards to Psychic Frog really easily, winning the game that way. And even if I'm fully convinced that this card is totally fine and balanced in the environment, there's still something nagging in my brain where I hate the idea of these games happening, where the card is really aesthetically out of place. It just kind of doesn't fit in with these other cards. I do also want to be clear that this is not some kind of blanket rejection of Modern Horizons 3. There are definitely Modern Horizons 3 cards that I like in other environments, and there are a couple nice ones that are going to have a more permanent home in this cube as well. I'm keeping Fel the Profane. I love the way that that one plays, where it's this kind of inefficient Hero's Downfall, but you can play it as a land. I also love just MDFCs. I'm a little cold on double-sided cards in this cube generally, just because there's a lot of reading. Anytime you have to flip them over, it kind of sucks. But specifically, the MDFCs with lands on the backside are just really easy to parse. You almost get all of the text just on the front. Just reading the front of Fel the Profane, you can see, oh, it's a land that taps for black on the other side. So they're way more approachable than a lot of double-sided cards. Certainly, Fable of the Mirror Breaker is a bigger offender in this cube, but that one's kind of iconic. I expect people to generally know it. Anyway, I'm also keeping Pyroglyph in the cube, that one from the MH3 Commander decks. I've been a big fan of how it plays. Notably, this is a cube without fetch lands. There's not going to be weird stuff like Kindred cards or random baubles or enchantments you can easily put into their graveyard. So mostly this is just a stronger Flametongue Kavu, and I think Flametongue Kavu would be pretty negative in this environment because it just punishes creatures and kind of incidentally makes planeswalkers stronger, because you can cut down any creatures that might be attacking. Like Flametongue Kavu is better at defending your planeswalkers than attacking opponents, whereas Pyroglyph can immediately use its ability to cut down a planeswalker, so I really like that aspect of the card. And realistically, this cube or any other 180 card environment is not going to get more than 1 or 2 cards from any set, so 2 cards making it in is actually a pretty good conversion, and I'm glad that I did try those other Modern Horizons 3 cards. Even if Psychic Frog didn't end up being something that sparked joy here, I did learn some things about the kind of stuff that I don't want to put in here. I learned that I really don't like having 0 mana effects that can generate some kind of permanent impact of the game on the cube, even when they're attached to spells that cost mana. That kind of stuff is just going to be less appealing to me here. And one of the great things about Cube is that you can always make updates. It's not a mistake to try new things, even when they don't work out. I've been looking at the Cube list a lot lately and zeroing in on what I like about the Cube. I like having a Cube where I can still play Moldrifter and Garruk Wildspeaker. I like the dynamic of Jace the Mind Sculptor versus Bloodbraid Elf. I like Grave Titan. And the recent journey I've been on with the cube has taught me some things that I don't like that I should avoid in order to preserve the things that I do like into the environment, and that's really valuable perspective to have. And just for posterity, I should say that Psychic Frog's slot is going to Slumgar's Command. It's a card that I've had in the cube before. It's powerful, but it is expensive at 5 mana. It's another high impact instant, and I like having some of that in the cube. Having Cryptic Command around was nice kind of for that element, but it was a little bit too much. So Slumkar's Command, being a multicolor option, costs another mana. It's going to be useful for control decks that are trying to play a longer game, certainly a game at instant speed, but it's not going to be overwhelming. At least it certainly hasn't been previously the way that Cryptic Command can be. Meanwhile, I did have a completely unrelated issue happening in the cube that did not overlap with MH3 or really any new set. It just was this rabbit hole that I went down where I was having trouble getting the balance right for blue, where blue would oscillate between being the strongest color of the cube, generating non-games, or being a little bit too weak and feeling not competitive. One way or the other, the pendulum kept swinging. And I think that this really started... I think it started before I added this card, but the card that stands out to me around when I started observing these issues and trying to tackle them is I added Force Spike. And I found that Force Spike was really way too punishing for creatures. If Force Spike is countering a 2-mana creature, often the game is over at that point. Blue has a lot of tools to stay ahead on the battlefield if it can stop itself from falling behind on those early turns. And so Force Spike was too powerful, ended up moving more towards Spell Pierce, but in the meantime I was also experimenting, okay, well what if I had some uncounterable creatures? And I had some stuff in green, like Balustrade Worm. So I guess these aren't Modern Horizons 3 things, but just some recent designs. I also tried Sirach Elusive Hunter, and this stuff was way too punishing for blue. And rather than just reverting that, I was like, well, can I play more in this space? Maybe I want to have these cards. There's something kind of fun about Balustrade Worm. So I was like, what if I tried Cryptic Command? And then Cryptic Command is this whole other can of worms where it's this super high agency, high power card where if you know what you're doing, Cryptic Command can totally lock an opponent out of the game. If you can navigate the aspects of when you're supposed to tap your opponent's stuff down, counter spells, bounce spells, the card just kind of does too much. It felt important to go in that direction once I had these uncounterable threats, but Cryptic Command was clearly over the line. And so I just kind of had all this stuff where I kept changing 1 or 2 cards, and I just realized, largely because I was thinking about Psychic Frog and how much I hate it, that something had gotten away from me. So I just spent some time just kind of pondering the cube and what was going on, and just reflecting on some experience playing in some other spaces. And I realized something that I have in the pre-modern Twobert that I don't have in this cube that could move things in a more positive direction is in that cube I have Birds of Paradise and Llanowar Elves. I had these 2 cheap mana creatures that can get in front of counterspells, where previously in the original Recipe Twobert I never had a Llanowar Elves card. I was a little bit worried about how much mana acceleration that green would have then, but more recently I've gotten up to 3 red 1-drops that I like, and so green only had 2 1-drops, and so there's a little bit more space for a 3rd 1-drop there. Llanowar Elves is also a card that plays in a way where it's kind of clear what's going on. If you can bolt the bird, if you can kill the turn 1 Llanowar Elves, you usually want to on turn 1, but then there are diminishing returns. The bad top deck gets much weaker as the game progresses, but then having the turn 1 Llanowar Elves, it does get you in front of counterspells and whatnot, so it plays kind of a more honest game, a game where cards like Counterspell can still be really strong, but where green decks can have kind of more elegant approaches to how to navigate the games where your opponent has counterspells. Another thing I did was just kind of get a couple more good 2-mana creatures in there, Scythecat Cub, Bristly Bill, and I also added a tool against counterspells that's a little bit more iconic, something that's really fun I always liked seeing in cubes, just more creature lands. Creature duels are a big part of this cube, and I decided to get Mishra's Factory into the spread. There's way less need for a card like Porcelain Legionnaire with how many good 2-drops there are in all 5 colors, so this extra creature land, I do think it's a nice value-added tool in this environment. It's also kind of nice for it to be something that is going to be stronger in a 2-color deck than it's going to be in a 3-color deck. You just have less space for colorless lands in a 3-color deck. And I have always found in this cube that 3 colors is a little bit more appealing than 2 colors, just with the way the cycle of lands lines up. You can often have better 3-color mana than 2-color mana, so something that's a little bit more powerful in the land column for 2-color decks definitely stood out to me. and I just scaled some other stuff back. I ended up having Roxanne Starfall savant in the cube, but that was a consequence of trying out Bloodbraid Challenger, and Bloodbraid Challenger just proved to be way too much value. That was another card that was embarrassing the blue decks and is really good kind of against anybody trying to take a controlling stance, just the way you can keep cascading and casting it from the graveyard. Just going back to Miglaw's Maze Crusher, just as a meaty 3-mana 4/4, and that's the kind of card that also plays a little bit better now that I have an Elvish Mystic in the spread. I went with Elvish Mystic over Llanowar Elves, I should say. I was saying Llanowar Elves before, but I went with Elvish Mystic because a card I was talking about earlier on the show is Grave Titan, where I feel like Grave Titan is the most aesthetically pure representation of this cube. Just like those 2010s era new cards are in core sets is really the vibe that I'm going for here, and Elvish Mystic just lines up really well with that. So I'm really excited to play more in this space. I made a number of other changes. Some other stuff I had like Flood Pit's Drowner, which is a really aggravating card for me to read. Just way too much text on that card. So I've been pondering new additions that, for lack of a better term, just have better vibes. I'm giving Psionic Blast a shot in the cube after really liking it in the pre-modern Twobert. The card is just unimpeachably cool, and it's a shot in the arm to the blue-red decks, which I feel have lacked some punch in the environment without going into black or white for hard removal. The games can just get away from them, and so this increase in burn spells give Izzet decks a little more reach without just adding more burn to red. I find that it's good for replayability when you have sideways angles like this that are facilitated by playing specific color combinations. And it's important that Psionic Blast is just a generally playable removal spell on the non-red decks, while also being really good for this blue-red kind of burn shell. Otherwise, there's a risk of making one color a little too narrow if I just have all this stuff and more of this stuff in red. So Psionic Blast does give a direction for somebody who really wants to play more of an aggressive, tempo-y burn deck, while not just saying, and that's what red is going to be about every draft. I'm trying out Sower of Temptation. It's another really high power creature. It's a 4-drop, so it's not the same kind of thing as Elvish Mystic, but it's similar tonally, where you have this really strong effect if your creature lives that's going to be vulnerable to creature removal. And that's kind of where I'm trying to push the games back in the direction of. So I'm really excited to try this changelog out, excited to kind of get back into this cube, going from working on really aesthetically focused designs and then going back and revisiting this very technical, more prescriptive design and seeing if I can apply some things that I learned playing in different spaces to this cube. Alright, one last note on one more edit. I did a draft Friday night, and when I was talking on the podcast here about colorless cards being an area where you can really have something be problematic, even if it's not the most powerful thing going on, I was thinking in the back of my mind, Smuggler's Copter's definitely always been on the watch list for this cube, and the draft I did Friday night, I was like, yeah, this has gone on too long. This probably never should have been in the cube. I like playing with Smuggler's Copter, but it's clearly over the line. It just goes in every deck. It does so much, and the fact that it's just immune to sorcery speed removal, it's a kind of a problem, and also to the extent that it does something kind of desirable, that it offers some insulation against sweepers. The addition of Mishra's Factory does help in that front, so I'm not just totally removing that element when I make this edit. And I've decided to try Mana Confluence in this slot. I've really liked having the City of Brass Mana Confluence lands in some other environments. I love having those 5-color lands in the pre-modern Twobert. And they show up not so much in like 5-color decks. They don't really stretch mana. The cost of life is actually kind of significant. You'll certainly play them in a 3-color deck, and maybe now and again you'll get a little wild and play a 4-color deck. But the deck that I drafted Friday night, it was a Boros deck, and I would have been really happy to have Mana Confluence. One thing about this cycle of lands here, Fast Lands, Shock Lands, Creature Duels, is you get those, maybe you get Prismatic Vista. Congratulations, you have 4 mana-fixing lands. Your mana is still a little tenuous, so I think that Mana Confluence is going to be a net positive for the environment, and I think that removing Smuggler's Copter is going to be a net positive for the environment. And some of that is scaling back on power, but more than that, I think that including the Copter was just kind of a bad choice regarding the fundamentals of the reverence I want to pay to the potential strength of cards that can go in any deck. And I do really want to highlight what I said about Grave Titan and it being the aesthetic avatar of the cube, because I think that aesthetics are more important than they've ever been in Cube. There's so many cubes now, so many environments, so many ways you can distinguish and show off your creativity. We're past the time where you can have a vintage cube or a legacy cube. We don't have to tether ourselves to kind of these basic technical aspects, and that's been a really fun aspect of playing more in the 180 card cube space. Is I have found different ways to move in different aesthetic directions. You can really highlight anything about Magic that you want to highlight. And an aspect of how the original Recipe Twobert kind of got away from me is that I was making changes based off of new cards and wanting to try new cards, but I wasn't really considering the aesthetic principles of the cube. As I was moving in the direction of having Psychic Frog, when I added it, I was like, okay, this is a mid-range cube, and I wasn't really inspecting things more closely than that. It wasn't readily apparent to me that discarding cards for value and getting permanent value for doing that was so misaligned with everything else in the cube. It was only after reflecting on some other environments that I came back to that. So I'm definitely excited to have this better aesthetic handle on this environment, and I really think that having an aesthetic vision like that is as important, if not more important, than a technical vision for Cube these days. That's definitely something you're going to hear me talk about more on the podcast here. At any rate, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. I'd also appreciate you taking the time to like, comment, review, share, all that jazz. And I'll be back next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.